everyone. I'm Georgina Downer. I'm the CEO of the Robert Menzies Institute, and it's wonderful to see so many of you here tonight to hear our visiting fellow, Dr. William Stoltz, speak about the Australian Secret Intelligence Service. I wanted to just quickly acknowledge Robert Menzies Institute board member David Kemp, who's joining us tonight, and the two of the sons of the first Director General of ASIS, Alfred Deacon Brooks, his sons John Brooks and Andrew Brooks. Thank you so much for making the effort to come tonight. It's really, really special for us, but particularly for Will to have you in the audience tonight. Before we start Will's presentation, I did also want to just make a special acknowledgement to the passing of a very dear friend of the Robert Menzies Institute. On the 3rd of May, Professor John Nethercote passed away, and John really is partly, if not solely, responsible for the revival of the interest in Menzies over the last few years. He edited a book in 2016 on Menzies, The Shaping of Modern Australia. He also was an editor of a book in 1995 on the Menzies era, which was the culmination of a conference. He worked for many years for the Public Service Board, Department of the Senate, the Royal Commission into Australian Government Administration, and all in all, he edited 36 books and an immense contribution to Australia's knowledge of good governance and its history. He was due, unfortunately, to give a paper at our upcoming conference in November this year on the 1951 double dissolution. We are so sorry we won't be able to hear his wisdom on that. He really will be sorely missed. But tonight you are hearing from, as I said, our visiting fellow, Dr. William Stoltz. We are thrilled that Will has undertaken to do this research into the Australian Secret Intelligence Service. It celebrates its 70th anniversary this year, and it was a creation of the Menzies government. I think it's really, in particular, going to be interesting tonight to hear from Will when we reflect on what was going on in the 1950s with the Cold War and the threat of communism, and what we are experiencing today in the 2020s with the threat of authoritarianism and the rising powers in our north and northwest that are really challenging us, particularly here in the Pacific. In the Menzies collection, which I hope you've had a chance to look at in our wonderful exhibition, and if you haven't, our curator is up the back there, Sam Rogers, can show you around. We have items that speak to the concern around communism in the 1950s, a copy of the Communist Party dissolution bill that Menzies introduced when he first became Prime Minister, trying to ban the Communist Party in Australia. We have a handbook that was given to Liberal candidates in 1949 when they were first fighting, they first fought their successful election, a case against Socialist Labor. We have a handbill that was used as advertising in the election by the Menzies team, that Chifley is afraid to smash communism. These really do evoke those Cold War tensions and the concern that people had at that time, and of course give you such an important backdrop to the decisions around the founding of ASIS. Will Stoltz is a senior advisor for public policy at the National Security College at the Australian National University. He holds a PhD and Advanced Masters of National Security Policy from the ANU, and he has a Bachelor of Arts from this university, University of Melbourne. I'd like to welcome Will to the podium. He'll speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then I welcome you to engage in rigorous Q&A with Will. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Georgina, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you for being here for what I hope is an interesting and timely discussion on a somewhat unknown aspect of the Menzies legacy, the creation of the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, our nation's foreign spy agency, which Menzies established 7 years ago. So firstly, thank you to the Robert Menzies Institute and the University of Melbourne for giving me the opportunity to speak to you this evening. I especially want to thank Georgina and all her team for the enthusiastic support I've received in being able to do this research. I think Georgina has exercised a great deal of leadership, not only to get the Institute off the ground, but to make sure that from the very beginning, RMI supports researchers both emerging and established. And I think that's a really terrific part of what prime ministerial libraries like this one can do for the academy writ large. I'd also like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the recent passing of David Irvine, who in the course of quite an amazing public service career served as head of ASIS. David had a deep respect for the importance of history and its value for informing public policy. And he was always a very generous supporter of emerging academics and public servants. And I think we dearly need more patriots like David in Australia today, and his loss is very sorely felt. So this evening, I will be discussing how and why Menzies and his ministers set up ASIS, but I'm aware that for many, the work of a secret service may not be familiar to all of you, some of you maybe. So I'll start by outlining what exactly a secret service is, before discussing the lead up and context as to why Menzies founded ASIS when he did. So the use of spies and secret agents is as old as civilization itself. Different cultures and political systems have had their own norms and traditions about the role of this profession. In Australia's case, our spies owe their lineage to the British tradition, which is encapsulated by this portrait of Queen Elizabeth I, known as the Rainbow Portrait. So you can make out in this painting that her dress is replete with little eyes and ears. After years of assassination attempts, foreign wars, and civil sectarian unrest, Elizabeth is flaunting that she hears and sees all. Indeed, in her efforts to secure her crown, Elizabeth was supported throughout her reign by one of the most sophisticated secret services in history, set up by her Secretary of State, Sir Francis Walsingham. While much has changed since the Elizabethan era, there are features of Walsingham's secret service still embodied in modern spy services of the British tradition, which include ASIS and MI6. Walsingham's spy network existed to serve the Crown, first and foremost, with intelligence designed to support the decision-making of the head of state and to protect her power. Further, Walsingham's operatives were given permissions and immunities to carry out otherwise illegal activities that only she could authorise. Their mandate to exist came from the monarch's executive authority, not from the legislative power of Parliament. For Elizabeth, as today, secret services carried out two related, yet distinct, sets of activities: the stealing of secrets to create intelligence, and the conduct of activities to secretly shape and disrupt external events. The former we call espionage, the latter is typically referred to as covert action. So these things remain broadly true today. ASIS's primary customer is Australia's Prime Minister and their cabinet, i.e. those executives of Australia's government who must make ultimate decisions affecting Australia's security and foreign affairs. Further, a legislated mandate is only relatively new for ASIS. For the first 50 years of its operations, it existed on the basis of executive orders, and even today it is highly subject to the discretion of Australia's executive leadership. And like Elizabeth I's network, ASIS has two functions, what I like to think of as ASIS's two hidden hands, one with which to steal secrets and another with which to shape events. So you'll note I'm using the term secret service and not as opposed to security service. Our security service is ASIO, which focuses on domestic threats. Where ASIS are our spies, ASIO are our spy catchers. So now that I hope you have a sense of what a secret service in the British tradition is, we'll look at the lead up to the creation of Australia's own secret service. So even prior to Federation, Australia's state governments had engaged in espionage overseas. This was primarily through commissioning officials and expatriates already operating in the South Pacific to collect commercial secrets and other intelligence about the non-British powers operating in the region. Australia's first federal governments would be similarly interested in the activities of other powers operating close to Australia's shores. The New Hebrides, what we now know as Vanuatu, was of particular concern for the government of Alfred Deakin, Australia's second Prime Minister. Deakin leveraged the Commonwealth's commercial agents in the Pacific to gain insights about French settlers and military positions in the islands and to help argue for a greater British presence in the Pacific. A decade later, during the First World War, because Australia had no dedicated external affairs department or established intelligence agencies, Australia's contribution to intelligence during the Great War was via the military. Following this, through the 1920s, Richard Casey, who would go on to help create ASIS, was embedded in the UK Cabinet and Foreign Offices as Australia's representative in London. Casey would see firsthand how MI6 intelligence from well-placed human sources informed the policy decisions of Britain's cabinet, including in wartime. Casey was also very envious of Britain's ability to secretly shape international events using what he called their black arts, covert actions to distribute propaganda, change foreign governments, and deploy paramilitary units abroad. Such was Casey's purported access to the British government that he claimed that some documents were marked as only for distribution to KCC, King, Cabinet, and Casey. Although I must admit I'm yet to find any examples of those documents, so I think he potentially was boasting. So Australia's approach to secret statecraft became more sophisticated during the Second World War, particularly in the Pacific. In the Pacific. The Allied Intelligence Bureau was set up as a joint organisation to pool Australian, British, Dutch, and American intelligence resources operating in the Pacific. Much of its activities were targeted against Japanese forces operating in what today is Indonesia, Malaysia, Timor, and Papua New Guinea. AIB comprised sections focused on special military operations, sabotage, human intelligence, rescuing POWs, and propaganda. Alfred Deakin Brooks, the grandson of Alfred Deakin, served in AIB in the sections focused on propaganda and sabotage behind enemy lines. As will be discussed, Brooks would go on from AIB to be the first Director General of ASIS. So, alongside Dick Casey, Alfred Brooks would be an important advocate for an Australian secret intelligence service. Following the war and his service with AIB, Brooks worked on the staff of External Affairs Minister H.V. Evatt, including during UN efforts to establish Indonesia as a separate state. It was during this time that Brooks proposed the idea of an Australian secret service, direct to Evatt, but to no avail. At a similar time, in October 1947, Dick Ellis, MI6's lead intelligence officer in the Far East, also visited Melbourne and Canberra to lobby the Chifley government to set up a standalone agency. He was similarly unsuccessful. The truth was that Chifley and Evatt had a difficult relationship with the British and American intelligence communities. This was particularly over the revelation in 1948 that Australia's Departments of External Affairs and Defence had been thoroughly infiltrated by Soviet agents. In 1947, decryption of intercepted Soviet diplomatic cables by the CIA indicated that the Australian government had been infiltrated. Soviet communications referred to the acquisition of top-secret Allied material that indicated it had been acquired from highly placed Australian sources. These are some of the copies of that material, if you can make it out. In January 1948, the CIA's Director of Intelligence briefed President Harry Truman on the compromise of the Australian government, stating, quote, "There is a leak in the high circles of Australia to Russia. The British government are now engaged in extensive undercover investigations to determine just where in the Australian government the leak is." An MI5 delegation visited Australia to address the issue, but the full origins of their investigation was hidden from Australian officials. To outline the leak, the MI5 delegation met with Prime Minister Chifley and Evatt, who was both Attorney General and External Affairs Minister. They explained the urgent need for reform to Australia's counter-espionage capability that MI5, MI6 and the CIA believed was required. They principally thought that Australia needed a dedicated domestic security service. Chifley and Evatt expressed scepticism that the leak had even arisen in Australia. Evatt felt that the British were exaggerating the seriousness of the situation, and Chifley expressed reluctance to undertake the institutional reform that was requested, which would require more rigorous vetting of public servants. Indeed, Chifley only agreed to the reforms, which would create what we now know as ASIO, after it was threatened that without the changes, Australia would be cut off entirely from the exchange of top-secret information. In recently declassified MI6 and CIA correspondence from the period, officials expressed concern about whether Chifley and Evatt regarded the challenge of Soviet espionage seriously enough. Of Evatt, they were worried about his ability to direct ASIO both as being Attorney General whilst also being External Affairs Minister, which was the department most subject to Soviet infiltration. There were also suspicions that Evatt's own office had been infiltrated. Conversely, MI6 and CIA officials expressed hope that Robert Menzies' newly created Liberal Party would be elected in 1949, believing them to be more favourable partners. There is also some evidence to suggest that Menzies and other senior Liberals were made aware of the Soviet infiltration prior to coming to government and prior to being officially briefed on the matter by ASIO. Had this been known to Chifley and Evatt, it would have confirmed the suspicions they, as Labor men, had long held about British intelligence services. After all, they regarded the British services as being populated by the same type of entitled patricians who had flung Australia's working men against German machine guns in the Great War, and who during the Second World War had conspired with Churchill to withhold Australia's Middle Eastern divisions from the Pacific. While the Chifley government was setting up ASIO and grappling with MI6, MI5 and the CIA over the Soviet infiltration, Menzies and Casey were laying the groundwork for the 1949 election campaign, which would place a strong emphasis on anti-communism and national security. By 1947, Casey had returned from overseas and was the federal director of the Liberal Party. He would also eventually be pre-selected for the seat of Latrobe. There he is with his pipe in his campaign poster. An idea for you, James, potentially, future campaign pictures. In his capacity as federal director, he employed Brooks in October 1947 as, quote, a specialist officer in the staff of the Federal Secretariat to deal with foreign affairs, imperial defence and subversive activities. These were doubtless very strange things for a political party to employ someone for, but it does make more sense when we consider the Liberal Party's agenda for the 1949 campaign. Banning the Communist Party of Australia was one of the Liberal Party's central campaign commitments, and the proxy wars and geopolitical tensions of the early Cold War placed foreign affairs, if not in the front of mind for voters, definitely at the forefront for Menzies, Casey, and other Liberal candidates who had held leadership positions throughout the Second World War. Viewing Liberal Party research reports from the time reveal a strong interest on the part of the wider party in foreign affairs and the risks of communist interference in Australia and its neighbours. While preparing these reports and working closely with Casey, Brooks would later express his desire to be pre-selected as a Liberal Party candidate for a Melbourne seat at the 1949 election, although this did not come to pass. We know that immediately after Menzies' election victory, Brooks advocated directly to Casey and Menzies to set up ASIS in 1950. But it is quite possible that Brooks lobbied for ASIS prior to the election win and while employed by the party. He had been forward-leaning in putting the idea to Evatt several years earlier, and it's almost inconceivable that he and Casey, if not Menzies, wouldn't have discussed the idea of an Australian Secret Service prior to the election. So it raises the following question: could the establishment of ASIS be seen as a secret election policy? So whether Menzies or Casey firmly settled on the idea prior to being in government or discussed it more widely with the party is currently unknown. However, I think it is fair to say that establishing ASIS was a distinctly Liberal Party policy, not just because of Casey and Brooks's enthusiasm for the idea, but it is difficult to conceive that Chifley's government would have set up ASIS if it were re-elected. This is because of the poor relationship of Chifley and Evatt with the British intelligence community, but also Evatt's multiple rejections of proposals to create an Australian Secret Service. While a future Labor government may well have set up ASIS, it's my view that it simply would never have happened while Evatt was both Attorney General and External Affairs Minister. So as mentioned, the idea to establish ASIS should be conceived of in the context of a wider agenda of national security reform undertaken by the Menzies government, which included the goal of banning the Communist Party, but also preparing Australia for a Third World War. Upon being elected, Casey was appointed as Menzies' Minister for National Development, not External Affairs, as one might have assumed, given his experience and passion for world affairs. That portfolio went to Percy Spender. So Casey's subsequent leadership within Cabinet for setting up ASIS is a little strange. However, in this portfolio, we need to think of Casey as the minister responsible for preparing Australia for a Third World War. At the time of the Menzies government coming to power, the Malayan emergency is taking place to Australia's near north, and the Korean War would break out shortly after in June 1950. Rehabilitating Japan was also still a huge focus for Australian, British, and American foreign policies, and suspicion of what path Japan might take was still present. Nuclear weapons were proliferating and advancing at great speed. Australia's capacity to deal with its changing world required the rapid development of its fuel security, port infrastructure, mines, and manufacturing, and all of which fell under the National Development Portfolio, which Casey led. So too did policy consideration for Australia developing nuclear technology and infrastructure, remembering at this time that Australia had not yet decided whether to adopt nuclear weapons. And the focus on developing Australia was not just about Australia's security, it was actually about Australia's contribution to Allied efforts to bolster the region. This is demonstrated by a correspondence Casey had with Bill Donovan, founder of the CIA, writing in 1950 on behalf of American businesses. Donovan wanted Casey to develop the Blair Atoll coal reserves in Queensland. Donovan's argument was that Australia needed to prioritise the development of these coal mines to provide secure energy supplies to the developing Japanese economy. This would ensure Japan's post-war industrialization, but would also keep Japan from needing Chinese and Russian coal and therefore falling into their political orbit. So by virtue of his portfolio as well as his past interests, Casey was fixed on the issues of strategy and geopolitics closely affected by secret intelligence and covert activity. The importance of establishing ASIS to Menzies' national security agenda is evidenced by the fact that on the day Menzies introduced a bill to ban the Communist Party, he meets with Casey, Spender, Phil McBride, the Defence Minister, and Brooks to discuss how the idea should be taken to the full cabinet. Casey then briefs cabinet on the proposal with the Malayan emergency as a critical context. He described how with a communist insurgency so close to Australia's borders and impacting upon a Commonwealth territory, that there was an urgent need for secret intelligence and covert options. To reinforce his case, Dick Ellis, MI6's head of Far East operations, was present at the cabinet meeting to take questions and to explain the work of MI6 in the region. Cabinet ultimately agreed to explore how the agency should be set up with support from MI6. Alfred Brooks is dispatched to the United Kingdom to observe and learn how MI6 operate and how it is structured. It's at this stage that the exact scope of work and structure of ASIS is still contested within the civil service. The Department of Defence is initially of the view that any special operations function should rest squarely with the military, while External Affairs is reluctant of the need for foreign intelligence at all, believing that their diplomatic reporting was sufficient. In 1950, Menzies writes to the UK Prime Minister Clement Attlee saying, quote, "I have decided to establish a secret intelligence service which, when organised, will operate in Southeast Asia and the Pacific areas adjacent to Australia. Recent developments in Asia, our near north, make this a prudent and urgent measure. Knowledge regarding this scheme has been restricted to the fewest possible here, and for added secrecy I have chosen to write rather than cable. I trust that the establishment of an Australian service may in some small way, reduce the onerous worldwide commitments on the United Kingdom." While it would be a small boutique agency, ASIS nevertheless reflected the focus of Menzies' wider foreign policy, which was decidedly on the preservation of British power in the Asia Pacific and the centrality of British power to the Cold War struggle for the region. In this sense, ASIS was envisaged as an empire agency that would plug in and support the intelligence needs not just of Australia, but of the wider Commonwealth. Behind this was Australia's larger aspiration to lead in the formation of Commonwealth strategic decision-making as it related to the region. So, adding more to the intelligence picture was viewed as a way to lend valuable decision-making leverage to the Australian government. As Menzies would say, quote, "Our decision was made in the light of the grave developments in Asia and in accordance with the policy that Australia should assume a larger share of responsibility for Commonwealth defence in the Pacific area." In addition to his correspondence with Attlee in January 1951, Menzies visited London and dined with the head of SIS, or C, Stuart Menzies, no relation, at Australia House. There is no apparent record of that conversation, unfortunately. But while Menzies and the Cabinet had decided in principle to establish ASIS, the structure and scope of the service was contested for a year or so. The key contested details were: should ASIS be responsible for covert action, or should it be with defence? Should it operate under a Foreign Service Act, as Percy Spender initially suggested? Who should be the responsible minister, defence or external affairs? And should ASIS use diplomatic cover? These issues were resolved, temporarily at least, when Casey took over as Minister for External Affairs and pushed for a final decision on the form of ASIS. The consensus decision emerged that the Defence Minister, in consultation with the External Affairs Minister via a special subcommittee of Cabinet, would be responsible for ASIS. ASIS's officers would operate with diplomatic cover, including British diplomatic cover, but its budget would be provided for by Defence. With Casey having helped iron out the finer details, Menzies finally created ASIS through an order of the Governor-General's Executive Council on the 13th of May 1952. So not via an act, as Spender had suggested. And Alfred Brooks was made its first Director-General at just 32 years old. Creating ASIS in this way, via an executive order and not an act, meant that the Prime Minister had signed it into being without informing Parliament. This not only reflected the high secrecy of the service, but also the often unilateral way in which Menzies wielded executive power when it came to national security decisions. Menzies did not regard it as necessary for ordinary members of Parliament to know that an Australian secret intelligence service had been established. Indeed, given his suspicions of some members of the Labor Party, he may not have trusted them with such knowledge. However, creating ASIS without legislation had the potentially unlawful result of the government concealing the service's funding in the defence budget to keep it secret from Parliament. Alongside the executive order creating ASIS, Menzies also issued an accompanying top secret directive, or charter, explaining in more detail the agency's functions. While today ASIS now operates under a piece of legislation, the Intelligence Services Act, its Director-General still receives these classified directives from the Prime Minister. In his top secret directive to Brooks in 1952, Menzies outlined that the purpose of ASIS would be the collection of secret intelligence, espionage, and the carrying out of special operations that, quote, afforded no proof of the instigation of the government, that we today describe as covert action. Importantly, the directive also instructed that ASIS would work closely with SIS, or MI6, and that Brooks would have direct access to relevant cabinet ministers, essentially allowing him to go around departmental secretaries. ASIS starts small in 1952, initially with 9 officers, but it had extensive access to MI6's intelligence products and stations in the region. ASIS would eventually establish stations of its own, the first being in Jakarta, Tokyo, and Bangkok, and another office in Australia for debriefing returning expats. For ASIS's covert action function, MI6 helped by dispatching stores of weaponry and other equipment as reserve stocks for ASIS's imagined wartime special operations. Casey would initially revel in being in charge of such an agency. On his travels abroad, MI6 found Casey to be the most frequent enthusiastic visitor, and he frequently hosted visiting MI6 and CIA officers at his farm in Berwick, where it is rumoured he allowed ASIS to use his airstrip for unregistered black flights. If nothing else, in letters to one another, Brooks and Casey had an extensive discussion about the appropriate locks that should be used on Casey's hangar. As ASIS expanded, it created a covert radio station in Kawundi in Darwin in 1953 in order to connect to MI6's diplomatic wireless service. This was used to receive encoded communications and, over time, support the interception of neighbouring countries' signals. By 1954, ASIS had 19 intelligence officers and 22 supporting staff. Its close relationship with MI6 was added to by the first CIA liaison officer being assigned to ASIS. Despite its steady growth, Brooks would run into trouble with his bureaucratic counterparts almost immediately. These principally included Frederick Shedden, Secretary of Defence, Alan Watt, Secretary of External Affairs, and Arthur Tan, Deputy Secretary of External Affairs. The main issues at play were responsibility for ASIS's funding and its use of diplomatic cover. As alluded to, ASIS had a somewhat confusing structure. It resided in the Department of Defense under the cover of the Central Plans section and had its funding hidden in the defense budget. But its officers were to work abroad out of British and Australian embassies and high commissions, whilst using diplomatic cover, but were often only accountable to MI6 officers. Initially, this structural separation from ASIS was looked on as a good thing from the mandarins within external affairs who wanted little to do with ASIS, but this quickly changed. So Alfred Brooks was a remarkable man. His experiences of Australia's region during the war made him incredibly worldly for his age. He was confident, cool under pressure, and charismatic, many of the features of an effective spy master. However, his desire for swift action meant he chafed against the hierarchy of the civil service, and his preference for relying on his personal relationship with Casey and Menzies put him offside with the departmental secretaries who were his superiors. For example, in his contest with Defence and External Affairs, Brooks directly complained to Menzies about the institutional rivalry. Brooks explained to Menzies that ASIS's relationship with Defence and External Affairs had degenerated to a, quote, a generally unfriendly and petty atmosphere. He sought the PM's intervention by asking that instead of being placed under defence, ASIS simply be made directly responsible to Menzies. However, due to Watt and Tang's concern over ASIS's use of diplomatic cover, it was eventually moved to External Affairs in 1954. Another issue for Brooks was his relationship with Casey. Casey and Brooks's personal relationship is probably the closest I've observed between a minister and an agency head. Theirs was the correspondence of two close friends, one the elder mentor to the other. And very frequently, Casey turned to Brooks for policy advice on topics well outside of Brooks's purview as DG of ASIS. Brooks also volunteered advice to Casey on how to engage with Casey's UK and US counterparts without consulting External Affairs. In this context, Brooks would write an extraordinary letter to Casey in 1955 on his view of what the ideal role of a secret service should be within the constructs of the civil service. Against the backdrop of the Cold War confronting Australia, Brooks argued that ASIS should be the central agency for setting national security and foreign policy. He argued that Australia needed a stronger capacity to deploy economic and psychological warfare against communist-aligned states. He was not sparing in his criticism of the wonks in Defence and External Affairs who looked down on intelligence and covert action, saying to Casey that, quote, it is important to gradually cure the thinking of the toffee-nosed orthodox that there is something queer or unpleasant about those willing to forego the fruits of office and engage in jobs which intellectually and sometimes physically might be a little dirty. The final straw for Brooks, however, came in 1957 when he took the extraordinary step of flying to Washington to meet with the US Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and the Director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, without engaging External Affairs and Defense. Among other things, he discussed with the Dulles brothers the sensitive and politically charged issue of potentially using Australia as a base for long-range nuclear weapons. It's ambiguous how much Casey knew or approved of this engagement. It's entirely possible Brooks was dispatched at Casey's insistence to broker this sensitive proposal without the wider knowledge of the bureaucracy. Regardless, this engagement was seen by Watt and Shedden as an irrecoverable act of roguishness. It appears that at this time, Casey also became less favourable to ASIS's operations. Brooks would later explain that Casey appeared to have become terrified that an ASIS agent using diplomatic cover would be exposed, and that as the minister responsible, it would lead to Casey's removal from office. In May 1957, while Menzies was absent for surgery, a number of cabinet ministers, including Casey, met with Shedden and Watt and decided to abolish ASIS. It's not clear if Menzies' absence was directly exploited. What proceeded was a flurry of activity in Canberra, London, and Washington to prevail upon Menzies to save ASIS at the 11th hour. The DG of ASIO, Colonel Charles Spry, and an old friend of Brooks, argued vehemently to keep ASIS, but with important restructuring that included the sacking of Brooks as head. It is clear from their letters that this decision troubled Spry greatly, as he owed his own appointment to Brooks, who had recommended him to Menzies in 1950. Meanwhile, Australia's ambassador in DC, Casey's old rival Percy Spender, was informed by the US State Department of their grave concern at Australia's decision. The CIA lobbied Casey directly against disbandment. But the strongest lobbying came from MI6. The Vice Chief of SIS, Sir James Easton, came in person to Canberra for a 5-day blitz of Australia's politicians and senior public servants, and he attended to Casey at his farm in Berwick. The message from MI6 and the CIA was that without ASIS, Australia could not expect privileged access to top secret intelligence. The intelligence relationship was still recovering from the Soviet infiltration of the 1940s, and a trusted Australian Secret Service, along with ASIO, was seen as pivotal to rebuilding trust for Australia. So it was that Menzies overturned his colleague's decision that ASIS was saved, but not with Brooks at the helm. So the story of Menzies' creation of ASIS 70 years ago reveals a government contending with many of the same issues concerning secret statecraft that Australia's government today still grapples with. Covert action and espionage are controversial tools of statecraft for liberal democracy. For Menzies, they were seen as tools to find influence and advantage in a fast-changing, uncertain, and hostile world dominated by the Cold War. Today, our outlook is not too dissimilar, given events in the South Pacific and further afield. Menzies leaned heavily on executive authority to create and oversee ASIS. But today, the pendulum has swung to legislating these things in more detail. But nevertheless, these agencies have extraordinary powers and are still subject to the judgment and discretion of our nation's most powerful executive leaders, just as they were in the Elizabethan age. ASIS, as a tool of British power in the Asia Pacific and an asset for the Commonwealth, adds complexity, I think, to our typical view of post-war Australian foreign policy being derivative of America's. The modern-day separation of intelligence and policy is very far from Brooks's view that clandestine services, as he called them, should be at the centre of policymaking. And finally, what I hope this study of ASIS's creation shows is that studying Australia's secret statecraft is possible, and indeed it is sorely needed, because today, like Menzies' time, hidden tools of shaping and understanding the world are again critical to achieving national advantage in a contested era. Access to source material like that in the National Archives, the National Library, and in collections even held here at the University of Melbourne are vital to building new and detailed understandings of these important agencies. Academic study and debate is really important to contributing to transparency in a democracy. So again, thank you very much to the Robert Menzies Institute for allowing me to undertake this study. And I said I made a commitment to the Federal Director of the Liberal Party that I would acknowledge the access they gave me to the Liberal Party archives. So I've done my due diligence there. And thank you very much for your time. And I'm hoping to have some interesting questions from you as well.
I was going to ask you a couple of questions first, but I know that there'll be lots of people in the audience. And I should acknowledge too, Senator James Patterson, thank you for coming along tonight in the middle of an election campaign. You've only got 2 weeks to go, so I know your time is incredibly precious. I do appreciate it. And Tim Smith, member for Kew, lovely to see you. And another RMI board member, Jeff Hone, thank you for coming along tonight too. I wanted to ask you a question, Will, about how you think ASIS has changed then since the vision of Alfred Deakin Brooks to 2022. Obviously, it's a lot more out in the open. Has legislation now. People, you know who the Director General is. Some of its senior leadership are known, but obviously its activities are pretty much the same as time immemorial, as you've explained.
Yeah, those core functions are unchanged, right? That responsibility for espionage and covert action. Obviously, the nature of the threat has changed dramatically. The focus of the agency up until quite recently has been on supporting counterterrorism operations, and ASIS, I suppose, for really the bulk of the last 20, 30 years, has been very much focused on supporting military operations abroad in the Middle East. That's obviously changing now because a lot of the contests that Australia faces are not under the cover of declared military operations. And so that's why I think that there's this really interesting parallel that's quite poignantly happening at the 70th anniversary, where the world and the operating environment of ASIS now resembles very much what it resembled when it was created. You mentioned the legislation that governs ASIS. What's quite fascinating going through the source material is, even though it took until 2001 and the 9/11 terrorist attacks to get the Intelligence Services Act, the fact that you can go back to the 1950s and ministers are saying, we should probably legislate something like this. It's probably a bit on the nose to just kind of use executive authority. And that props up multiple times throughout ASIS history where, Royal Commissioner Robert Marsden Hope and other Director Generals of ASIS say, yeah, we really like a piece of legislation. And that's partly for their own sense of security as well. There's Director Generals who feel that they need that parliamentary mandate to exist so that they can actually be confident about what they're actually able to do, and that there is a kind of a legislative safety net for them to fall back on if something goes wrong.
I wondered if you could comment too on the in the very early days, that sort of sense of a turf war between External Affairs and Defence and ASIS. Was it because it was a turf war, or was it because Brooks's approach was just so unusual, and he just saw he had a direct line to the top, and that was the way he was going to approach things, and it just ruffled feathers?
Yeah, I think there was definitely his personal style ruffled feathers. I think that's true. But it's worth remembering, I suppose, that for Australia, because we had gone through the First World War and the Second World War leaning very much on the intelligence apparatus of the United States and Britain, that I don't think there was actually a very good appreciation within the public service, within defence and external affairs in particular, about the value of intelligence. The comments that you get from members of the diplomatic corps just saying, well, our cables should be sufficient, thank you very much. Like, we're here on the ground writing these lovely reports back home. What on earth do you need intelligence for? And I think that there was a sense that it was a bit beneath a country like Australia, and these things were kind of a bit dirty and on the nose, and it'd be good if we didn't have to do them. I think that was part of it. Certainly the special operations function was very much seen by defence as, this is a military thing. This shouldn't be conducted by civilians. But the British example, because these things were fused in MI6, was very much pointed to as, no, this is the way you have to do it. So we very much kind of carbon copied the structure of MI6 there.
Now to the audience.
Yeah. Well, the fact, and that's what's curious, because he wasn't there when the first decision was made. I think he was recovering from surgery. So it does look like they were exploiting his incapacity in order to get that decision signed off by cabinet, which he obviously came back over the top and overturned it.
The persuaded cabinet.
Yes, yeah. Well, persuaded is forced, persuaded.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah. So it was acknowledged in 1977 by the Fraser government. And a lot of that actually was kind of a fallout of the first Royal Commission into Intelligence and Security, the Hope Royal Commission. The extent, though, of the public awareness of it, like there had been newspaper reporting on it, it kind of wasn't a very well-kept secret in Canberra at the time, but that official acknowledgement of it came in 1977. But it was a pretty paltry statement to Parliament, I can tell you that. It was pretty much a couple of sentences in a speech to say, oh, by the way, we have a secret intelligence service. Moving on, we're not going to talk about the detail of what it does. And so it isn't really until you get, subsequent Royal Commissions and the Sheraton Hotel affair in particular, that you get a little bit more explanation of what ASIS's role is. And then again, with the Intelligence Services Act in 2001, you get a bit more detail again. The key thing is it's constantly contested, and it needs to be constantly contested. I think it's a really difficult thing to justify for a liberal democratic country to do, and you need to be constantly reevaluating the principles that guide these things. I personally I can't really land on a very firm position on some of these things. So take, for example, ministerial knowledge. So on the one hand, there's an argument to say, well, ministers should only ever be provided with the insights garnered of the intelligence. They shouldn't get to see the source material. They shouldn't know the human sources that are being used, the methods used to get that intelligence. All they need to know is the insights, the end product. Where that gets tricky for me is in the issue of covert action, because you do need a degree of creativity and you need a degree of contestability that actually can sometimes happen at the ministerial level. So if a minister who is looking across all the different things that Australia is doing in the world might actually have a vantage point to be able to be coming up with ideas and coming up with proposals of what Australia should be doing, that a bureaucrat may not necessarily feel comfortable devising. What's interesting about the classified directive that guides ASIS is that this is a document where the Prime Minister and ministers can actually preemptively delegate. So you can say, well, the Intelligence Service Act says that you have to get approval from me for all these things, but I'm, as a minister, going to make a decision to say, well, there's all this low-level stuff that you really don't need to come to me for, and I'm going to preemptively delegate that to you as the Director General of ASIS. That decision is so much around the personal risk appetite of a minister and a Prime Minister. So, yeah, I don't really have a firm view on exactly what the kind of core principles should be. I mean, I tend to lean to thinking that we probably need a greater degree of parliamentary oversight on these things, not necessarily parliamentary oversight to scrutinise individual operations like what happens in the United States, but parliamentary oversight to understand that risk appetite, to understand the broad policy settings of the government of the day and scrutinise that. That's kind of controversial opinion. There's many people in the Australian public service who would definitely not want more parliamentarians looking at these things. But I think when it gets to reconciling that problem of how do you justify this for a liberal democratic society, only Parliament has the moral authority to justify these things, in my personal view.
Do you have a comment on that, James? James is the chair of the, I'm going to get it wrong, Joint Parliamentary Committee on Security and Intelligence. Ish. And you're keeping mum. That's right. Thank you, James.
It's getting away. That's all right. Well, certainly Percy Spender thought that there should be what he called a Foreign Services Act. I think he wanted to put some clarity around the limitations of the usage of diplomatic cover to perform intelligence and covert operations. I think his view was that it was probably fine for you to be using diplomatic cover for the collection of intelligence. Using diplomatic cover to start doing things a bit more proactive than that was probably a bridge too far. But I think that the context of the infiltration of defence and external affairs that happened in the 1940s, the suspicion of the Labor Party on behalf of the Liberal cabinet ministers, and just the general concern around communist infiltration in Australia just meant that they just didn't countenance growing the circle of people that could be aware of ASIS in those early days. So I think it didn't go, there was discussion, but it didn't go very far. Yeah, so it started off with a very broad remit for special operations, at least as far as the authority went, in terms of the actual training and capability of the agency to actually do those things. It starts out very small. And I think the view was that they could just kind of lean on MI6 and CIA to do those types of activities. But that paramilitary function, that gets really pulled back under Whitlam. So he, when he gets properly briefed on ASIS ahead of the election, and then when he becomes Prime Minister, he pretty much says the only reason that you'll ever use force is essentially there's actually a war happening and you're kind of like the last line of defense of Australia. You know, think about it in the context of what's happening in Ukraine at the moment as the country is being invaded, the things that our agencies are having to do. He pretty much said that's the only imaginable context in which you could use force in that way. Then that kind of stays the norm until the 80s, and then starts to be loosened up again in the 90s, and then particularly in the War on Terror era. And that's when you have initially in the 2001 Intelligence Services Act, there's a prohibition on ASIS officers handling weapons, and then in 2004 there's an amendment to say that they can carry weapons for their own self-defense. Well, I think, for one, the collective experience these people have in the Second World War is really formative to understanding the value of these things. And because intelligence and covert action or special operations is happening in a military context, I think that there's just a general predisposition that these things should be kept within the realm of the military. But I think you're quite right to point out that these things are highly susceptible at this time in history to the kind of proclivities and oddities of people's personalities and personal preferences and tastes. And I think that goes to show just how tight, small, and elite these decisions were. There was a really, really small group of people that were making these decisions. The public service at this time was not nearly as open to the type of diversity of people and the number of people that it is today. And so contestability of ideas was really not there. And when you get these firm, big, gigantic personalities kind of ruling departments and agencies with quite an authoritarian style, it does mean that the whole organization kind of ends up being reflective of that personality. And it's quite interesting with Brooks. I mean, the fact that he was essentially family friends with Casey and Menzies, he didn't have a security clearance, and or at least the security clearance he'd kept from his military service was probably by no means suitable for the things that he was discussing. He's there speaking directly to Menzies and Casey, pitching the idea of covert action and foreign intelligence service, and they're not doing that in a secret room over a secret telephone. They're doing it over lunch at the Melbourne Club, or there's a hotel that, in Casey's diaries, there's one pub that they pretty much have all these conversations. And I just think, if there was a Russian at that pub, the things they would have understood. So again, I think it just goes to, the type of people, the types of close personal relationships that are really at play at forming these really big decisions of statecraft and policy, which is quite alien, well, not entirely alien to how we do things these days. Certainly personal relationships matter, but there is much more structure and contestability around how these decisions are made today.
We have run out of time, for which I am very sorry, but thank you so much, Will, for that illuminating presentation. I think you'll all agree that was absolutely fascinating and really revealed in 1952 how Australia was a very young nation, and we were building things from very little. And we were building them in a very uniquely Australian way. We weren't drowning in bureaucracy. We didn't have several, 100 layers of government and rules and regulations imposed upon the decisions that were taken. They were taken in light of the geopolitical realities of the time, obviously with the influence of our friends in the US and the United States, but led by people who had inspiration and drive, and the individuals really mattered, which is key. And I think you've opened up a fantastic prospect for further research.
Yes.
Hopefully a book. No pressure, Will, but thank you very much on behalf of the Robert Menzies Institute. And I've got some lovely Menzies wine here for you too, as a token of our appreciation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.